Decent-sized walk up here. It's great to be with you. Great to be at Johns Hopkins University. And I want to thank you for having the largest nameplate I've ever had in front of me at a panel I've been able to moderate. Let's get right to it. I want to introduce our two debate participants this evening. General Michael Hayden is with us tonight. He is central not only to the intellectual debate about security, the Constitution, privacy, but he is an actor, a real live actor, participant in debates within the White House, within the intelligence community, and within the Justice Department about these very issues. He was the 15th director of the National Security Agency from 1999 to 2005, and he was the 20th director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 2006 to 2009. In between, he was the deputy director of national intelligence. Please welcome General Michael Hayden. Also, someone very active in the intellectual and practical dimensions of this debate, David Cole, who teaches constitutional law, national security and criminal justice at Georgetown University. He has published 7 books on this very topic. He is also a legal affairs correspondent for The Nation. He is one of the most sought-after thinkers on the subject of national security, intelligence, its application, the lines of privacy, and where it intersects, or in some cases doesn't intersect, with constitutional protections. Ladies and gentlemen, David Cole. I want to begin with a quick note. I missed 2 trains from DC to try to get up here tonight, so I was in the cab and I was texting my best friend who lives in San Diego. His father is a 1962 graduate of this distinguished university. And I texted him and I said, "Hey Steve, what did your dad graduate in?" "Physics." "What year?" 1962. "What did he do after that?" "He made the first prototype, or was a researcher on the first prototype drones to spy on the Soviets." I bring that up because this issue is not new. National security is not new. Spying, espionage is not new. Americans have participated in it, learned about it, practiced it, and constantly debated within government and with the public at large the limits and the parameters of security, privacy, and how it fits under the umbrella of our constitutional protections. And we're going to do that tonight. What I want to start with both of our guests, I want to start with you, David, and then General Hayden, you. If you could, give us your encapsulated sense of the most important underlying issues and where you come down on, as our introducers talked about, the practical realism of security, constitutional protections, and privacy. David?
Well, I think I'm clearly the realist here, and General Hayden is the idealist. So we'll start there. With respect to the specific topic of the NSA and what we've learned the NSA has been doing in our name without telling us, we've learned thanks to Edward Snowden. I think the basic issue is that to have a functioning and healthy democracy, I think you need 2 things. You need transparency from the government, and you need privacy for the citizenry. We need to know what the government is doing so we can hold those who represent us accountable. And we need to have privacy so that we can have the freedom to develop our own intimate lives, our associations, and our political ideals without fear that the government is looking over our shoulders. But I worry that in the modern era, we've essentially flipped that. With the government insisting on secrecy for itself and transparency from all of us. And so what I find most troubling about the disclosures that we have we've seen over the last several months is that we have learned that the NSA has engaged in dragnet surveillance, gathering up massive amounts of information about people who have nothing to do with terrorism whatsoever, including all of us. Including all of us. Secondly, that they've done that in secret, through secret interpretations of laws whose authors, when they learned that this was what the NSA was doing, said this was nothing that I ever authorized. Jim Sensenbrenner, a Republican, very conservative from the House, who drafted the provision of the Patriot Act that the NSA then used in secret to gather all of our phone data. He said that was never contemplated by the law that I drafted. And then finally, we have a government that not only engages in secret again, to gather data on innocent Americans and innocent foreigners as well, but then lies to us about it to keep us from knowing that. So James Clapper, who you saw briefly in the introduction there, was asked under oath in Congress, are you collecting data on millions of Americans? And what did he say? He said no. He later said that that was the least untruthful answer that he could give. I can think of two more truthful answers. One would have been yes, that would have been the truthful answer, and another would have been I can't confirm or deny, which is what the government often says. But he didn't do that. Instead, he chose to lie to Congress, to lie to the American people. Why? Presumably, he may well have had good intentions, but it certainly is interesting to me that now that we know about this program, every branch of government that previously said it was fine has begun to question it, and it's likely to end.
General Hayden. A couple of things were mentioned there that I'm sure rang in your ear. Secrecy over transparency. We have flipped the common understanding of privacy and security. That there is dragnet surveillance that the government has intentionally and in a premeditated way lied about. Your response?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, Major. But first of all, I want to suggest that we aren't two alien life forms up here. We come from the same political culture. And actually, we're fairly good friends. But these are very difficult issues in which we as a free people are not trying to decide between good and evil. We as a free people are trying to balance values, okay? Values that are sometimes very competing. Major, I'd come at this in two ways, but there are lots of things to talk about. I've taken in the last couple of weeks kind of describing the dilemma we're in as a triangle, all right? And when we're all really happy, it is a very content, harmonized, equilateral triangle in which all the sides are the same length. And the three sides are technology, the nature of things that threaten us, and our law and policy. And what's happening to us in recent days, and this isn't new to 2014, it's happened before in our history, but it's happening at an accelerated rate. Those three sides of the triangle, those three angles which create those sides, all three of them are changing perforce at different rates. The threat changes at a certain rate, technology changes at another rate, and law and policy changes at a third rate. And so when we're all very happy and harmonized and synchronized, our equilateral triangle is like this, and we're all in broad agreement. And then when they change at different rates, that happy equilateral triangle turns into this violently grotesque isosceles triangle that creates all sorts of tension. And we're in tension until we get that triangle back to that equilateral balance. Now the problem becomes, Major, and this is, and David, and this is the fundamental issue, I think, frankly, that David and I agree on, is what's the process by which we get that triangle back more or less into balance? And that process has been changing somewhat throughout American history. I mean, just as a matter of fact, not of philosophy, of reality. Okay? What we're talking about here is surveillance, and for most of our history, surveillance was the province of the executive. I mean, our first spy master was George Washington as head of the Continental Army, and then he gets elected president, and he wants a covert action budget. He wants a secret budget from the Congress for his use for covert action. And we kept, like most democracies, really, the governance, how do you get that triangle back to being equilateral? We kept that governance within the executive branch until the mid-1970s. And then with the Church Commission then and all the thereuntos pertaining about both real and alleged excesses, we decided that we needed to bring the other branches of government into this decision-making process. How do you get the triangle back into balance? And so we set up congressional oversight committees, the House Permanent Select Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and a court, an unusual court, but a court nonetheless, that again joined in the process by which we keep these things in balance. That was kind of representative democracy in action. That was our representatives working to balance the triangle again. And what's happened in recent times, and I understand this, okay, that a good portion of the American society now no longer views that process I just described, House, Senate, Intelligence Committees, FISA Court, Executive Branch, no longer considers that to be consent of the governed. There are an awful lot of people out there who say, okay, you may have told Mike Rogers and Dianne Feinstein, but you didn't tell me. And until you tell me, then you really don't have a legitimate consent of the governed. Now that's a very challenging issue. When I was director of CIA, I had a civilian advisory board with some really prominent Americans on it, and one of them was Carly Fiorina, formerly of Hewlett-Packard. And I gave Carly and her subcommittee a very difficult problem. It was this. Seeing this is pre-Snowden. Carly, I've been wondering, will America be able to conduct espionage, which after all depends on secrecy? Will America be able to conduct espionage in the future inside a broader political culture that every day demands more transparency and more public accountability from every aspect of national life? Carly and her team went away, studied the problem, came back about 4 months later. They're in my conference room across the hall from my 7th deck office at Langley. I walk across, I sit down, okay, Carly, will America be able to conduct espionage, more transparency, more public? She looks me right in the eye and says, we're not sure, okay? Which is a very profound answer. And that's where we are. How much transparency, how much of your personal participation in the decision-making process will you demand to get that triangle back into an agreed balance? And at what cost in the capacities for which we had the triangle in the first place, which is fundamentally stealing other people's secrets?
All right, I want to bring this to a practical level. David, I've dealt with this issue a lot at the White House, and I've listened to countless briefings from all sorts of people within the White House and intelligence community apparatus. And one of the things that they often tell us, and I want your opinion on this, is a matter of judging security, the law, and privacy. Metadata, they say, is all of this data, numbers and locations. That by itself is not equivalent to eavesdropping, recording, or transcribing any conversation, intent, or anything like that. It is sifted in a vast analytical way using algorithms and other forms of intelligence sifting to cull in very fast action those things which might set off legitimate intelligence clues or links to clues. And then everything else falls out. And the fact that the vast majority, they say, falls out makes this much less of a security and much less of a privacy and constitutional issue than those, from your perspective, would represent. How do you respond to that?
Well, you know, this is the constant mantra.
I'm just distilling it.
No,
I believe I've done so faithfully. I'm not describing myself to it, but that's what I hear every day.
So it's a great question, right? You saw it in President Obama. We're not listening to your phone calls. We're not listening to the content. We're just collecting the metadata, which means who you called, when you called them, how often you called them, how long you talked for. That's all we're collecting, just the metadata. So you shouldn't need to worry about it. Well, You know, I take my cue from a former general counsel of the NSA, Stuart Baker, who said on this question, metadata absolutely tells you everything about somebody's life. If you have enough metadata, you don't really need content. It's sort of embarrassing how predictable we are as human beings. And that's the thing is, you know, with metadata, they can know when you called your girlfriend, when you called your ex-girlfriend, when you called your parents, when you called your children, when you called Alcoholics Anonymous, when you called a drug rehab center, when you called your drug dealer, when you called your political party. They know all of that. They can connect up. Who are your closest friends? Who are you most closely associated with? Who do you talk to all the time? Who do you talk to only sometimes? That's a tremendous amount of information that they can get. And we got it from General Counsel of the NSA himself. We don't even need content if we can get metadata. And let me just add, the program that we've all been talking about is a phone metadata program. But the law under which the NSA gathered this is not a law that limits to phone company and phone data. It's a law that allows the government to get any business records on anybody, and in their interpretation, literally anybody and everybody. And so they could get email records, who you've emailed, who's emailing you, what websites you're searching, what searches you put into Google. All of that goes to businesses, which then have those records, and under the NSA's theory of how American law should run, they can get any and all of that information, because it might happen that at some point, some of it might be useful to try to find a terrorist. To me, that's dragnet surveillance at its worst, and the distinction between content and metadata really is erased.
Is erased. And this is all done under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is the secret court that weighs, as I said, in secret, the legal justification for putting together a search of metadata linked to a person or persons, and then gives it an okay or a not okay, and it is on a time limit. General Hayden, you can find out all these things David just said about me, about David, about anyone in this audience. That is a function of operational capability. I'd like you to talk about whether you're comfortable with that operational capability. If so, why? And how often is it used in the ways that David described?
Yeah, first of all, David's description of what you can do with metadata, and quoting a mutual friend, Stuart Baker, is absolutely correct. Okay? We kill people based on metadata. But that's not what we do with this metadata. Okay?
Thankfully.
Wow, I was working up a sweat there for a second.
It's really important to understand the program in its entirety, not the potentiality of the program, but how the program is actually conducted. So NSA gets phone records, gets them from the telephone company. They've been getting them since October of 2001 under one authority or another. Puts them in a lockbox, to use a phrase that was popularized a few years ago, and under very strict limitations can access the lockbox. What it cannot do are all those things that David suggested that allows someone to create your social network, your social interactions, your patterns of behavior. One could make the argument that that may or may not be useful. One can make the argument that may or may not be legal, but it's not done. NSA does not launch powerful algorithms against this domestic database in order to see inherent patterns not visible to the casual observer. It doesn't do that at all. Here's what it does do. When NSA has what it's called a dirty number, a seed number is how NSA refers to it. And a seed number almost universally is a foreign number. And it's a number that NSA has a reasonable articulable suspicion is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. So you roll up a safe house in Yemen, you get somebody with pocket litter that indicates he's a member of the cell you thought was there, and he's got a cell phone. Now this is a new cell phone number. What you get to do against that ocean of data that NSA has admittedly collected, your phone bills and mine. What you get to do is kind of figuratively yell through the transom and say, hey, anybody in here talk to this number here in Yemen? And frankly, if a number out there near Fells Point says, well, yeah, I kind of do that about once a week, NSA gets to ask that number in Fells Point, so who the hell are you talk to? At which point, this program is over. That's all that's authorized to be done with the metadata. The last year for which NSA has full statistics, they got the yell through the transom 288 times with foreign seed numbers they had reason to believe were affiliated with Al-Qaeda. By the way, that permission to yell through the transom is confined to fewer than 24 people at Fort Meade, all specially trained and all whose keystrokes are monitored to make sure that everyone is doing this according to the FISA court direction. 288 times they yelled through that transom and said, hey, anybody here talk to this phone number I think's affiliated with the terrorist? And in those 288 inquiries, 6,000, a total of 6,000 over the course of a year, U.S. numbers were implicated for further examination, but further examination separate from this program and under law enforcement authorities and court orders under the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So in this debate, it's important to distinguish what might be done with what is being done. I mean, if you take the argument that if it might be done, then I should assume it is being done and therefore I oppose it, that's a pretty powerful argument for disarming your local police force. Okay. It's not a way a mature people should look at balancing how they want to defend themselves and preserve their liberties.
Let me introduce a name that was raised earlier that is probably familiar to just about everyone in this audience, Edward Snowden. Now, General Hayden, you just said potentiality and reality should be distinguished between, and what you can do and what you operationally do are a distinction worth investigating. I think you would also be willing to admit, maybe begrudgingly, that we wouldn't be having this conversation. This symposium would exist, but we wouldn't be participating if it were not for the unauthorized disclosure of the vast array of NSA activities which were known by a select few members of Congress, were known by the intelligence community, were known by the President of the United States, but were not known by those of us who cover the White House or the general public. And that to have this mature debate in the vacuum that existed before, meaning a vacuum of knowledge where nothing existed, would have been impossible. And you have, on the program that you and I were on together, Face the Nation, when I was lucky enough to substitute for Bob Schieffer, you came close to labeling Edward Snowden a traitor. How can it be traitorous to kick off and initiate a debate that is obviously of interest to this audience and millions of Americans across the country?
Yeah, you've got to, first of all, to make the judgment about Snowden, you've got to look at his actions in their entirety. But let's start with the narrow slice that you raised. Freely admit, Edward Snowden precipitated a debate that frankly was inevitable, but he certainly precipitated it. He certainly misshaped it as well. And I can talk about misshaping all you want as we go forward. But I don't understand what the civil liberties quotient of telling the world that Memwith Hill Station was used to intercept the satellite phone call of Dmitry Medvedev during the G20 meeting in London. I don't understand the American civil liberties quotient of his revealing that the United States may or may not have penetrated computers in the People's Republic of China. I don't understand the American civil liberties quotient of what it is the United States may or may not have done against foreign leaders. And I can go through a whole series of things.
That strikes you as malicious.
More than 95% of the information revealed through the Snowden dossier has nothing to do with your privacy. What it has done is made it much more difficult for your intelligence services to defend you.
Okay. We'll take that as an answer, but let me follow up, and then I want to bring David into this and to respond. But there is now a change in the president's approach to this. He no longer wants the phone companies to store this data.
He wants the phone companies to store it.
No longer wants the NSA to store it in a retrievable, nearly permanent basis. Wants to go back to the phone companies. It's a live issue before Congress. On those issues, The president wasn't initiating the debate. The intelligence community wasn't initiating the debate. Nobody who was a central operator was initiating this debate. And as the president has admitted on the record numerous times, this technological expansiveness was growing on his watch, and he was quite happy about it.
Yeah.
This technological ability to catch more and more things, sift them faster, analyze them more critically, was a wondrous thing, all done in secrecy. Identifying that alone, do you not find anything praiseworthy in what Edward Snowden initiated?
I'm not going to go out of my way to praise young Mr. Snowden. By the way, all right, the president in his proposal isn't trying to fix any abuses. I mean, he's made that quite clear. You know, this was being done just the way he wanted it to be done, and it had not been
Just stored differently.
It had not been used for any other purpose. I mean, he has been explicit. I mean, when he made the speech after his commission reported to him, he essentially said, this program is effective, this program is lawful, this program has not been abused, and now I'm going to recommend we change this program. And he followed, he wanted to change the program to make you feel more comfortable about it. I get it. That's fair enough. But it's not because it was wrong or misused or was abusing your rights. He just wants you to be more comfortable about it. Look, when I was down the road here at NSA, I used to think you had to be three things to be sustainable in the American political culture in our espionage services. Technologically feasible, operationally relevant, it was possible, it was useful, and lawful. Okay? By the time I got to CIA, my little Venn thing here with technologically feasible, operationally relevant, and lawful, I realized I'd lost one Venn oval in that, and that was politically sustainable. The president gets to do one-offs with raw Article II authority and narrow lawfulness. Okay? No president, no matter how popular or unpopular, gets to do a program over a sustained period of time without that fourth oval, politically sustainable. Major, the president's doubling down on the program. He's all in. And the trade-off for being all in is to keep the phone records in the hands of the phone companies so that you're comfortable with it. Now, make no mistake, he liked the program, and what he's done is continue it.
David, I've given you like a full field of things to deal with here. And I want you to take them in the order you find most important and have at it.
Yeah. So the president is not doubling down. Snowden is a criminal and a hero. General Hayden's description of the NSA program that the president has now said he will end was very anodyne and I think quite misleading. To take the last one first, you shouldn't be concerned because, you know, the government's not really looking at these numbers. It's just collecting all your numbers, and it's only looking at them 288 times. Well, a court and the President's Review Board that looked at this program and examined it found that each query can generate 1 million phone numbers. If you assume that somebody called 100 people over 5 years, which is a fair assumption, and you assume that the NSA with one phone number can get every phone number that communicated with the seed number, and then every phone number that communicated with a phone number that communicated with the seed number, and then any number that communicated with those, you quickly get to about 1 million phone numbers. What do they do with those phone numbers? They put them in what they call the corporate store. The corporate store. So they have millions. In just 1 year, they have 288 million phone numbers in this corporate store. There's only about, what, 300 million of us? So they've got a lot of our phone numbers, right, in the corporate store. And then what are the limits on their ability to look through that corporate store? None. Zero. That corporate store, there's no reasonable suspicion requirement. There's no requirement to go back to court. None. So I'm not so, you know, I don't think it's such a program that we need not be concerned about. General Hayden also said there was no abuse. The abuse was that the government was doing this in our name without our approval. That was the abuse. And then lying to us so that we could not check them on what they were doing. Of course, political sustainability has to be a core of what a government agency does, General Hayden. In a democracy, that's what it's about. Technical feasibility, sure, but if it's not politically sustainable, you shouldn't be doing it as a representative of the American people. Whether this program was effective, well, there have been claims that it was effective, but the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, an executive, a congressionally created, executive-appointed, independent board that got access to all of the data and interviewed all of the people involved in this program, found that in 7 years of collecting all of our phone data, the NSA did not stop a single terrorist plot, did not bring a single terrorist criminal to justice. There was one case, only one case that they could point to, where they identified a criminal, a quote-unquote terrorist criminal, through the NSA program. And what was that? It was somebody who tried to send $3,000 to a group in Somalia that's a terrorist group in Somalia. That's it, for 7 years of collecting all of our phone data. I don't call that terribly effective. If you're balancing liberty and security, privacy and security, you don't have much on the security side of the aisle. Was it necessary? Was it necessary? Well, if it was necessary, I would expect the president to be insisting on continuing the program. But instead, he has ended the program. He has called for ending the program. Here's what the program was. It was that the NSA could, on a single court order, collect all of our phone records, keep them for 5 years without any suspicion about any of us, and then without ever going back to a court, they could troll through it when their own people determined that they had reasonable articulable suspicion about a particular phone number. That's a very low level of suspicion. That's the suspicion that a cop needs to stop someone and ask him a couple questions on the street. But they didn't have to go back to a court at all. They needed no court order, and they were able to collect all of our phone data. Under what President Obama has proposed, the NSA will collect none of our phone data. And they will only be able to search when they first go to a court and demonstrate that they have a justified reason for conducting a specific search. That's the way the Fourth Amendment was designed to work. That's the way law enforcement works. That's the way intelligence works under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That's the way the NSA should have been working, but it wasn't until Edward Snowden told us what was going on, and suddenly everything has changed.
And on Edward Snowden, you said he's two things.
He's a criminal and a hero. He clearly committed a crime. I'm not going to deny that he committed a crime. He had access to this information on the condition that he not disclose it. That's true of lots of whistleblowers. They commit crimes. It's not the case that they're not criminals, but it also can be the case that at the same time that they commit a crime, they can do an awful lot of good. And I think a situation in which you've gone from a system of purported checks and balances in which the president, the courts, and Congress have all allowed something to go forward as long as it's secret, as long as the American people don't know about it. And then as soon as the American people learn about it, the president says we should end it, a court says it's unconstitutional, and Congress has about 35 bills pending to reform it. That suggests that there was some real good done by the disclosure.
A couple of footnotes to what David just said. The NSA Inspector General did find instances, not under practice, but committed nevertheless, of messing around in this metadata.
The love int.
Yes.
That's not in the metadata.
Not in this program, but they
program.
did love int, and they found plenty of violations. There's plenty of FISA court opinions finding many, many violations because of the way in which the program was set up, et cetera. I will agree with General Hayden that we haven't seen, a J. Edgar Hoover bugging, Dr. Martin Luther King and threatening to expose secrets unless he, gives up fighting for civil rights. We haven't seen that yet. I will give you that. But I don't think that's all that we need to be concerned about. in a country that values privacy.
And one other thing I would point out, covering the White House on a daily basis, there has been a contraction in the expansiveness of the president's own rhetoric about what this surveillance has actually achieved. He started saying dozens of terrorist plots foiled. That doesn't show up in his rhetoric with any frequency anymore. And now it's harder and harder to get the president to say actually in public that this did, in fact, stop terrorist plots. I know, General Hayden, you believe
I feel like
that
the referee just moved the football on me.
well, go ahead then.
I thought you were supposed to be in the middle.
No, I'm just telling you what the president's. I'm just talking about observing the president's rhetoric and a visible contraction down from saying things which he once did with confidence, that there upwards of 50 terror plots have been foiled.
50 includes both this program and the 702 program, the email program.
Right, and he no longer says that. And one of the reasons he no longer says that is because his own, and this congressionally mandated board, plus the other one he put together, questioned just how many times this type of surveillance operationally thwarted terrorist plots.
Yeah.
You believe it did.
What I'm telling you is it is a very useful intelligence tool. All right, and if you're going to tell me I only get credit if this program leads to me tackling somebody about ready to chamber around on the rooftop, then I freely admit, no, we didn't do that. All right, but it adds to the intelligence picture, and it adds.
All right, distill for this audience what its value is. If you would argue and contend that it's a false metric to say this data stopped this plot from happening, saving X number of lives, what would you argue is the way to measure its utility against the Constitution and privacy?
Well, let me give you one way to measure it, all right? If Barack Obama could have canceled this program in his first month in office, if he could have done it in conscience, he'd have canceled it at the speed of light because he was trying to put as much distance between himself and his predecessor as he could. And so, to me, one of the almost intuitive endorsements of the program was that this president, who so much campaigned on being not the other president, said, you know, I want to keep this around. But let's get to
as long as it was secret.
Well,
and as soon as it was out in public, he said, let's get rid of it, which is what he's done.
Now, David, I'm going to challenge get rid of it, all right? So what he's done is NSA will no longer hold. First of all, let me apologize. I'm going to pull you through a cryptologic knothole here because the details matter. Okay? NSA was gathering the data, but it was mostly because the program began with me at the National Security Agency in 2001. It was mostly landline stuff that was being brought in. And as our communications patterns have changed from landline to cell phone, and cell phone represents, in terms of doing this with it as billing records, a far greater challenge than the old landline system did, the percentage of your phone records ending up in NSA got smaller each year that went by. So that by the time we get to this current chapter, NSA is getting not 100% of phone bills in the United States, but somewhere between 20 and 30%. Okay? Now what the president's new proposal does is, I'll tell you what, to make you comfortable, to make sure you don't have any fear that there could be any potential abuses, I'm not going to let NSA keep the stuff. I'm going to let the phone companies keep the stuff. But I'm still going to have a system by which I can query it. And I'm going to let NSA form questions in the President's bill, David, you're right, through the court. In the House bill, not through the court. But when the President allows NSA to frame the question, NSA gets to address through the telecoms, through the telco providers, 100% of the data. In other words, this new program has made what existed before far more comprehensive than it has ever been in the past. And the trade-off for that is you should feel more comfortable because the government doesn't possess the data in any way that would then allow any potential abuses to occur. There are a bunch of other things out there. You talked about violations. There was a headline in the Washington Post last August. Bart Gellman wrote the story. NSA internal report records thousands of violations per year. If you go through and parse Bart's story, and if you know a little bit of the background, it's really interesting. He catalogs 3,600 violations in the course of a year, which of course tracks a lot of headlines. when you read it, 2/3 of the violations were what NSA called roamers. So NSA is on a foreign phone number. Let's just say it's, pick your foreign country. It's in Pakistan. It's covering a foreign cell phone. Unbeknownst to NSA, that cell phone comes back into the United States, or comes into the United States. It makes a phone call from the United States, but for billing purposes, it goes back to its telecom provider in Karachi. Otherwise, they don't get their money. And then that phone call then comes back into the United States for its intended recipient here, looking every inch in the world like it's coming from outside this country. And only over time does the physics of the intercept or the content of the call tell NSA, oh, that foreign guy with that foreign phone is now in the United States and therefore is protected by our Fourth Amendment. It is illegal for me to collect on that phone. In 2/3 of the violations, it was that, roamers. There was another violation that the Gelman article listed. It said that there were 160 instances where NSA had put too broad search terms into already legitimately collected foreign intelligence. And those search terms then, because they were too broad, brought back information that should not have been brought to the attention of the analyst, thereby squeezing the privacy of both U.S. and non-U.S. persons in the database. 163 times that happened in the course of a quarter in that year. That would be 163 times over 63 million inquiries. So let me give you an alternative headline for Bart Gelman's story. Alternative to NSA violates privacy thousands of times a year. The alternative headline is NSA damn near perfect. So we need to keep these things in perspective as we go forward.
That's probably a scary headline for you.
Well, no, I'd be
in the
great
sense
if-
that it would
well,
be
that's true.
accurate,
Yeah.
but also
Yeah,
endemical to your sense
perfect,
of what this
perfect
program
knowledge,
should be.
perfect knowledge of everything that we do. That's the goal here. Perfect knowledge of everything that we do. I don't think that was the headline for the FISA court judge who was so disturbed by the violations of his own order that he, for a period of time, required NSA to go to a court each and every time it conducted a query because he was so disturbed by the violations that had gone on under his under the terms of his order. So, and as to whether or not President Obama is basically just making us feel better, and in fact really doubling down and getting 100% where he got 30%. It's true that over time, because of cell phone use, the percent that the NSA was getting dropped, but it's also true in the same story. The NSA said, yeah, we understand that problem and we'll be back up to 100% in no time, number one. And number two, the basic difference is the difference between dragnet surveillance and targeted surveillance. And that's the difference that our Constitution has long drawn. The Fourth Amendment was adopted out of a concern that we don't want the government to be able to just get everybody's information or have access to everybody's information and then, decide on its own who it wants to actually search. What we want instead, we're not against surveillance. Nobody's against surveillance or intelligence. What we want is targeted surveillance, targeted intelligence, where you show that you have a basis for acting, and you show an independent entity that you have a basis for acting before you intrude on somebody's privacy. And that's what President Obama's new program would do. That's not what the NSA program did. It intruded on all of our privacy without any showing that any of us were engaged in any kind of wrongdoing, kept it for 5 years, and then searched through it on the say-so of executive officials without ever going to a court.
Forgive me, I'm going to invoke a TV term here for a second. The run of show of the evening. We got off to a kind of a late start, and we're having such a great time up here, and I think you are too. So we're going to go for a while, but I want to let everyone know that now if this iPad works and I'm able to use it, two very important distinctive issues. I'll start taking questions that you have submitted and arrived to me here, and as I wait for those questions to come in, let me just put something before the two of you, because it sort of goes to the heart of what people's expectations are. David and then you, General, is there an implied right to privacy in these kinds of communications that is inviolable? I mean, do we have a constitutionally protected right and assumption of privacy? Because there's a Supreme Court case on this that I know General Hayden will invoke in a moment that suggests otherwise. Where do you come down on that, and what should this audience know about the legal sinews of that question?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think, you know, I actually don't think the law is settled on this. So, back in the day, before Al Gore invented the internet, the Supreme Court adopted a rule that said if you share information with a third party, you assume the risk. You voluntarily tell your friend, for example, that you committed a crime. You voluntarily assume the risk that he's going to go turn around and tell the government that information. So you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in information that you share with your friend, and that means the government can, you know, ask your friend to tell them. It can put a wire on your friend. It can put pressure on your friend to tell them, et cetera, and the government does that, right? That was then applied to phone metadata. When you make a phone call, the court said, you tell the phone company who you're calling and for how long, because they need that for billing information, and therefore you've shared that with a third party, and therefore the government can get that from the phone company without invading an expectation of privacy. You know, in the modern digital age, that principle no longer holds. And I think many, many people across the political spectrum have begun to recognize, including Supreme Court justices, that it just no longer makes sense. Why? Because everything we do today shares information with a third party. Every time, you know, when I walked into this room with my smartphone, I was sharing with Verizon that I'm here with General Hayden. When I search the web, I am sharing with Google my interests. When I read an article online, I'm sharing with whatever both the online subscriber service and the producer that I'm reading that information. Should the government be able to get all of that data, your location data, your phone contacts, your emails, your Google searches, should they be able to get that without any showing that there's any basis for suspecting that you've engaged in wrongdoing? I don't think so. I think we have an expectation of privacy, and I think there's a real difference between my voluntarily telling Major Garrett or General Hayden something and my, you know, living in the modern world in which you literally can't exist without at every moment sharing information with a third party. I don't think that should mean the government should have it. And I think the Supreme Court in a case just 2 years ago on GPS data showed that it's beginning to recognize that you can't translate pre-Al Gore rules to the post-Al Gore world.
General Hayden.
Yeah. First of all, the things that Professor Cole just described about sucking all the brains out of your cell phones, I know of no government program that does that. All right. So what we're talking about here is what we talked about earlier, which is your telephone metadata. And Major's right. It's Supreme Court decision, 1979, Smith versus Maryland, 5-3. There is no constitutional, which is different than maybe a limitation in law, but there is no constitutional expectation of privacy with regard to those kinds of records. In law enforcement, it's called pen register, trap and trace, and so that's what was used. Now, that's really important because after 9/11, I had to testify in front of a joint inquiry commission. There's a picture on the cover of Time magazine, probably spring of '02, with me, Bob Mueller, and George Tenet with our right hands in the air. And the Joint Inquiry Commission was a combination of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. What went wrong for 9/11? Right? And I actually was rereading it last night, not for purposes of this, but just by happenstance. The criticisms of the JIC, the Joint Inquiry Commission, of NSA. And the criticisms in 2002 of NSA, looking back on the 2001 attacks, was simply NSA showed far too much caution with regard to terrorist communications, one end of which was in the United States. And that the NSA had to be simply far more aggressive in tracking down and detecting and monitoring those calls. The metadata program, because of Smith versus Maryland, because it because it wasn't constitutionally protected, because it was a field in which you had a little more room to run, we believed that it was the lightest possible touch on American privacy that we could devise and still respond to the needs articulated by your elected representatives as to what it is we had to do better to defend you.
Okay, good. Oh,
And
excellent.
I would just say, if
Go ahead.
that's what NSA thought the lightest touch was, collecting every person's every phone data, then the NSA is a little bit out of touch with what the lightest touch would be.
Well,
And
first of all,
that's number one. Number two, you said, I don't know of any government program that's sucking up all this information. Well, in fact, the NSA is, under 702, collecting massive amounts of location data from cell phones around the world, address books and contact lists wherever it can get them from foreign sources. It is collecting the contents of literally every phone call from one country. We haven't been told what that country is, but from one foreign country, every phone call, and then they can search through it when they want to. Now, it's not our data, it's not our phones, it's not our locations, etc. At least most of the time it's not, but sometimes we're talking to those people, number one. And number two, those people have privacy rights too. And if we say, well, we want to protect our privacy rights, but not the privacy rights of anybody else, then what's to stop the British intelligence, or the French intelligence, or the German intelligence, the Russian intelligence from gathering from us all of the exact same stuff and saying, well, there's no problem with that because you're doing it to our people, so you don't have no basis for objecting if we do it to you. I think we really need, as a world, and this is what you see in the European debate, to agree upon some limits on spy agencies around the world using the new technology to spy not on the, the bad guys, the leaders, the foreign agents. That's expected. But on you and me.
Okay, real quick, because I want to get to these questions, General Hayden.
Keep in mind the distinction David made. Everything he just described is foreign, not domestic. Has to do with legitimate foreign intelligence targets, not with U.S. persons, which is a broad definition that includes more than just citizens of the United States. And I should add, David asked the question, what is to stop those other nations from doing those kinds of things against you? And the legitimate answer is absolutely nothing.
And that's a problem.
That's
we
what
shouldn't play
foreign
into that.
intelligence services do. This is an R-rated movie. It's for adults. Nations conduct espionage against other nations. One additional thought, okay, because it's woven its way into the dialogue, and I should have mentioned it earlier, about guilt and innocence and suspicion and suspicionless and so on. Those are law enforcement terms. Those are not intelligence terms. Intelligence doesn't listen to just bad people. Intelligence listens to interesting people. Intelligence listens to people whose communications contain information that help keep you safe and free. They don't have to be guilty of anything to be a legitimate foreign intelligence target.
Well, that really worries me, General. The greatest ambition of my life is to be bad and interesting. We're going to get to your questions here in just a second. But I want to tell you a quick story. I just got back from the President's trip to Europe. The last stop we made was in Saudi Arabia. And I want to just tell you a couple of quick stories about that trip that are, I hope, in some small way, illuminating to this technology and how surveillance has its own portability, if you will. We were in Saudi Arabia. I was not in the White House pool that day, so I wasn't with the President when he went to see King Abdullah in his desert kingdom hideaway. But several reporters were, and one of them was a good colleague, friend of mine, Carrie Budoff-Brown of Politico. And she happened with her smartphone to take pictures inside the compound where King Abdullah was seeing the president. She posted those on Twitter, and within about 10 minutes had 8,500 new Twitter followers, all from Saudi Arabia. Why? Because they are completely unaccustomed in that country to seeing anything approximating an impromptu photo of the king. She was unwittingly a surveillance actor for people in the Saudi Arabian kingdom who followed her on social media and wanted to see if there might be more pictures of the king in a somewhat unguarded, non-ceremonial, completely hatched moment. Now, it was a semi-hatched moment because these things always are, but that's just an indicator of how that information had a value, had almost like a surveillance value in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, let me tell you a slightly more interesting story from Brussels. I think you'll all find this somewhat fascinating. It's in a bar. There's a colleague of mine who is an attractive producer for a network. She was approached by someone who was in the security forces in Brussels. And let us say he was kind of flirting with her. So they became Facebook friends. Then she left the bar, got on the bus, goes to the plane. On the way to the plane, on the White House bus, she gets a Facebook message from this gentleman's wife, who follows him on Facebook relentlessly, saw that he had friended this attractive woman, and immediately said, "Did my husband tell you he's married and has a child?" Which completely freaked out this person, and let's say, as my 17-year-old son would say, harshed her mellow. I mean, it just like completely froze out the moment. I only raised that because it was in a sort of odd way, publicly visible operational surveillance in real time of genuinely innocent human interaction. Technology now creates the literal bandwidth for people to act in ways that they never could before, maybe on their suspicions, maybe on their hunches, but it does, it seems to me, create a different context as we think about these issues. And it brings to two questions that were here from the audience. One, to you, David. Questioner asks, why should I care that the government knows I called my mom and emailed my professor? We should not have anything to hide. Secondarily, what should private actors like Google or Facebook that mine data for commercial purposes, how does that fit into this debate? Are they also privacy predators? I put that before both of you. David, you want to start?
Yeah, so I think that privacy is a critically important value, even if you have nothing to hide. I think I'm not alone in thinking that. The founders of our Constitution put it in the Fourth Amendment into the Constitution because they understood that to have a free society, you really do need to have some space where you can engage with others, whether in intimate relations or in political dialogue and discourse, and that without that, there is no such thing as a free society. That's why, George Orwell's 1984 has the TVs that are watching you all the time. That's the sort of the symbol of a kind of fascist society, of a totalitarian society, where they want to know everything about you and they don't give you any space to dissent, any space to develop, any space to have your own relations without having the government over your shoulder. So, I think privacy is important for those reasons, and it remains just as important today as it was before the internet and before the smartphone. We have to construct new rules to preserve our privacy from the kind of threats that major stories illustrate, indeed from Google and Yahoo and the like as well. In Europe, there's a much greater sensitivity to this concern, in part because many of them, their grandparents lived through what the Nazis did with access to private information, and it wasn't pretty. And they know, therefore, that this is incredibly important to keep personal data personal, to keep it private, and they have very strict restrictions not only on the government's ability to get access to your information, but also on private companies' ability to use that information, trade that information, collect that information. They can't do that unless they get your specific approval for each use. It drives Google crazy because that's Google's business model. But I think we may have to start thinking about that if we want to maintain privacy in the modern digital era. And I, for one, certainly want to, and I think most of us do. Most of us still close our bedroom door. Most of us password protect our computers. Most of us don't have some kind of privacy provisions on our Facebook accounts. We don't want the whole world to know everything about us, and we certainly don't want the government to know everything about us.
General Hayden, real quick.
Yeah, vital agreement on David's first point. The argument that, hey, I don't mind you listening to my phone calls, I have nothing to hide, is not an argument for this. And you don't hear anybody who does this for a living claiming that that's a good argument. It's a horrible argument. As Americans, we deserve that private space. All right? The second point about what the private sector does in terms of gathering information, it's a really powerful question, and one in which we are decidedly undecided as a people. Where is that line that we continue to negotiate between ourselves as private individuals and as public individuals? And that's shifting on us in ways that are very challenging. By the way, Major, that makes it very hard. Remember that triangle thing I started with? It makes it very hard for your security services because they have to divine almost on a daily basis where that line is, because frankly, they are required by the Fourth Amendment, to guard, to protect you against unreasonable search and seizure. And because of the shifting line between public and private self, that definition of reasonable and unreasonable is a moving target. Final point about the private sector. There was a really interesting story, I think with Greenwald and that new thing he's got with the writing, I think it's called The Intercept. Talking about GCHQ, which is the British equivalent of NSA, intercepting Angry Birds signals. Apparently Angry Bird sucks the brain out of your iPhones, okay? And sends it back to the Angry Bird Starship, where they gather the data and then sell it. So all those free apps you thought you had, okay? By the way, if you download a free app on the web, you are not the client, you are the product, okay? What GCHQ was doing for selected foreign intelligence targets was targeting that link back from legitimate foreign intelligence targets who were stupid enough to download Angry Birds. As it was sending that information back to, like I said, the Angry Bird Starship, GCHQ was intercepting that data. Frankly, it's an intelligence stroke of genius. It's a really great technique. But the real question is, what the hell is Angry Birds doing with all that data? Because it's not GCHQ going out there and pulling it out of your cell phone. It's those free apps you keep downloading.
Other questions, several along this line. Does the threat level change this debate? I know, General Hayden, operationally after 9/11, you revisited this issue and dramatically, or if not dramatically, you intensified the search. And you mentioned the criticism of the NSA post 9/11. The President frequently says, David, that the threat remains real. It is changing. It is moving geographically. He gave a huge speech at the National Defense University saying that not only his administration, but any administration of either party that comes after that, after his administration, is going to have to deal with smaller, more mobile, but still malevolent cells within Al-Qaeda or affiliated or sympathetic units, and that tracking them is going to be a government imperative to achieve, if not perfect security, at least near perfect security. Does the threat level change fundamentally this debate?
Well, I think the threat level affects, sure, it affects the balance. If at the broadest level we're balancing privacy and liberty and autonomy against security, the greater the threats are to security, the more it may make sense to give up some liberty, some privacy, some autonomy, if it in fact make us more secure. So if you live in a war zone, you expect that you're not going to have the same kind of privacy as you do in a free society. So Yeah, it makes a difference. I think the key to me, though, is that we as a society draw that balance, that we strike the balance, that we make a reasoned and informed decision about where to strike the balance. And what I think is most troubling about the Snowden disclosures is that what we've learned is that the government has been striking this balance without telling us in a lot of ways that once we learn, we're not very happy about it. And there's something fundamentally wrong about that.
General Hayden?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll go back to the language of the Fourth Amendment. We are protected against unreasonable search and seizure. Reasonableness is a product of the totality of circumstances in which we find ourselves. So clearly that line changes based upon threat. I mean, there's no question about it.
And do you believe, and we've had a conversation about this, that the nature of the threat will continue to change and test the limits
Yep.
of both surveillance through data and other ways, human intelligence, satellite intelligence, et cetera?
You bet. Now, we need to be careful here, all right? We have looked at the 215 program. That's the metadata program. 90% of our talk here has been on 215. Snowden revealed a whole bunch of other stuff, which is subject to debate. The 215 program unarguably is tied to terrorism. There is no other legal justification for it. Terrorism threat goes up, that should go up. Terrorism threat goes down, that goes down. Other programs, 702 is one that David mentioned earlier. That has to do with email content, foreign, but housed on American servers. That's not just terrorism related. It's quite clear that has to do with proliferation, with terrorism, and with cyber threats. So there's another body of circumstances that affect the legitimacy of that. My old community has erred in trying to justify too many of the things it does based strictly upon the terrorist threat. But in this case, the 215, the metadata program, that's it. That's the only justification.
We're going to get to closing statements now. David, I want to ask you in your closing statement to describe for this audience, articulate if you will, if not a perfect world, a world of balance that you find that you'd be comfortable with legally to weigh and balance these threat versus constitutional versus privacy issue. And if you would amend or intensify the president's proposal on this, describe how. And if you're comfortable with it, describe why.
Oh my God, that's a closing statement. That's another evening's discussion. I guess my bottom line is that these are hard questions. That I don't think anybody, even the most ardent civil libertarian, is against surveillance, is against spying, is against searches. I think what I'm against is dragnet spying, dragnet searches, by which I mean situations in which the government is gathering information without showing that it has a need for this based on what the person is doing. And that's what we've seen far too much of, both with respect to the local metadata program and with respect, I think, to the 702 program. When you're collecting literally the contents of every phone call from a foreign country, that is the definition of dragnet surveillance. That is disturbing. The second thing that's disturbing to me is the secrecy that has surrounded these programs. And that secrecy, I think, it's been demonstrated. And one of I think probably the most important lesson Edward Snowden has given us is that you can set up all the checks and balances in the world within the government, having to go to a court, having to tell the members of Congress, having a president who's elected by the people. You can have all that, but it's not going to work if at the end of the day the American people have literally no idea what is being done. Because what we've seen here is that once the American people, before the American people knew what was going on, all those entities lined up and said this program is fine, and once it became public, every one of those entities changed its behavior in a significant way. Publicity and transparency about what the government is doing is critical. And yes, secrecy is important for surveillance and for espionage and the like, but it's also important to know that the government is following limits that we are comfortable with. And until This era, we had that. Under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, we knew what the general constraints were on the government. And then the third thing that I find just absolutely unacceptable is the government lying to us about what it's doing, and Mr. Clapper's statement in Congress being the principal example. That has to be unacceptable. He's never been called to account for it. That I think is a travesty. So I'm not against surveillance. I'm against dragnet. I'm against secrecy, and I'm against American government officials lying to the American people.
General Hayden.
Yeah, lots of things to discuss here at the end. I'll try to be very brief. We need to be precise. These are highly emotive issues, but we need to think through, and I apologize again for drawing you through very, very detailed, specific things about how this is done. But frankly, without that kind of knowledge, it's very difficult to make the correct kinds of decisions. Let me just give you a couple of broad considerations. David mentioned about mass surveillance and so on. There is actually a distinction between bulk collection and mass surveillance. They are different things. And I just ask you, when you hear bulk collection, do not automatically assume that it's mass surveillance. They can be quite different. So don't confuse those two things. David mentioned that it was a shameful thing that someone is collecting all the telephone calls in one country on earth, and I'm not able to say what I'm going to say now because I have no idea what country that is. But I would feel differently about it if it were France or if it were Afghanistan. So facts matter. Details matter. The blanket statement, isn't that awful, may not apply. David mentioned the need for more transparency. I agree. I'm there. I understand that's what we have to do. And by the way, those little 4 Venn circles there where political sustainability is one thing, political sustainability and lawfulness are not the same thing. There are times when things are unpopular but are right. But over the long term, that democracy does need, when it does these kinds of things, it does need the broad support of its people, and therefore my old community is going to have to be markedly more transparent than it has been in the past. We get it. No, trust me, I've met with folks still in government. They understand. What you have to understand is that there is no way that increased transparency does not shave points off of operational effectiveness. There is a cost, an operational cost, in making more of this stuff more public to more people. You just have to understand that in order for you, and to use David's words, in order for you to be a bit more comfortable, you are indeed going to be a bit less safe. That's just the way it is. One final point. It's 2 or 3 times now we brought up Jim Clapper. I would have answered the question different from Jim, all right? But Jim's a good friend and an honest man. And it was a horrible answer to, frankly, and here's the new news, a really horrible question. Ron Wyden knew the answer to that question. Everyone on that dais, every member of that committee knew the answer to that question. Everyone sitting behind every member of that committee, all those sissies, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence staffers, knew the answer to that question. That question had been briefed to them multiple times in closed sessions. What Jim should have said was, we'll take it to closed session. He didn't. But Senator Wyden doesn't get a free pass either. If he wanted Jim Clapper to commit a felony and reveal something that at that point was appropriately classified, Senator Wyden should have just acted like a man and revealed it himself, rather than trying to trap a career public servant into what for him would be a criminal act. This thing cuts 2 ways.
And with that, we will conclude our evening. David has a 10-10 train to catch, and I want to make sure he catches his train. Give it up for both of these excellent participants. It's been a pleasure to be your moderator. Thank you very much. I know we went long. Indulge us for that, but thanks very much.
Could we get one more round of applause for all 3 participants in tonight's debate?